This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
Today on CityCast Madison. If you have a driver's license or a state ID, a day might come where you are asked to serve your fellow citizens, maybe even deliver judgment. Today we're talking about jury duty, a cornerstone of how our society dispenses justice. But what actually happens when you're summoned for jury duty? How do the courts decide who can be fair and impartial? Bianca Martin is going straight to the source. She's talking to Dane County Circuit Court Judge Nicholas McNamara. It's Monday, April 15th. I'm Dylan Brogan, and here's what Madison's talking about.
Judge McNamara, hello.
Hi there. Hello.
So exciting to have you. Thanks for taking the time on your lunch break. Very generous. We're talking about something key to our democracy today, jury duty. Why do we have jury duty?
Well, it is an important part of our democracy, and actually it goes way back. Like before even English common law, there were communities and cultures that had juries of different kind of compositions. Eventually, though, it evolved in England and then came over to the U.S., where citizens are jurors. And as our democracy expanded to actually include people that had been excluded from political participation, like enslaved people or women. Most notably, yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's become obviously more and more representative. And it's the jury's job to resolve factual issues.
You know, it's something that folks probably don't think about every day if they're not in the criminal justice system. But until maybe they get a letter in the mail that says, it's your time to do your duty. You're an instrument of public justice to your community. Like, this is the space for people to engage in the justice system. Like, outside of voting, this is kind of the other way to be involved democratically, I suppose.
I agree with that. Unlike voting, however, jury service is compulsory. We require everybody to be on a jury, and they can't get out just because they don't want to do it. There's obviously oftentimes good reasons for a person not to be able to do it. It just happened that someone who works in my office, one of the people that helped me do my job, just got notice over the weekend that she's been called to jury duty for federal court.
So no one is immune.
Right.
But speaking of immune, I'm curious how you feel about people trying to get out of that. What do you make of that urge, unless someone has a legitimate reason? Do you think they're missing out on something? Does it make you feel some kind of way as a judge?
Well, I do try to emphasize the role of the jury and preserving, I think, the opportunity for justice to be done. But it is inconvenient. The courthouse is one of the most inconvenient spaces in the entire city and county by way of parking, if you know where it is.
That's true.
We have weapon screening. We don't have child care. We don't have nice, quiet places. We do have places for nursing mothers, but it's not a generally welcoming space. I've been a judge for 15 years now, and I've learned when I just bump into somebody in the hallway who I know personally to not ask them why they're there, because there's really probably not a real positive reason. There's not a whole lot of good things that happen. And jury service is kind of the most neutral, I guess, but even that might be a disappointment for some people.
What would you say some of the biggest misconceptions people have around jury duty?
Well, I would think that most jurors, after they've given us a verdict, I always invite them to stay. I talk to them and answer any questions they have. I intentionally do not ask them about their decision process. We're not really allowed to, and I don't want to know. But I just try to answer any kinds of questions. But very often the most common sort of information I get about the actual experience was that it was a lot more interesting than they expected. They really enjoyed it. They appreciated the court staff. My courtroom and my jury room is a beautiful space for for anybody, but for public issue, it's incredible. We overlook Lake Monona, and it's just a gorgeous view. And the jury gets a corner space with lots of windows, and they really like it, and they're surprised at that. But honestly, content-wise, they usually found it a lot more interesting. Now, sometimes, though, the trials can be very, very emotionally difficult. And all of my cases are criminal trials. If it's not a little bit boring, it's likely to be very, very emotionally difficult. But jurors still generally think the process was interesting and a positive experience for the most part.
I wanted to ask you about that, in terms of some of the more emotionally challenging cases. I did jury duty in Dane County probably a decade ago, and I have to admit, I was so stoked. I'm a civics nerd. I was ready to go and have my opportunity, and I was picked. And then in the process, it was, a family feud over land and something that was very personal. And I remember getting kind of the ick, this feeling like, oh God, I have to weigh in on these people's lives. I'd rather, I don't know. I was really conflicted. And for you, it's quite literally your job to make judgments. But also, many of us, you're raised not to be judgmental. It can be considered rude. Like, what do you say to someone who might feel uncomfortable making these kinds of decisions for others?
Well, the lawyers do ask questions kind of like that, like, how many of you think it's going to be difficult for you to do this? And I really don't particularly like that question because it should be difficult. And I don't want to give jurors the idea that if they say, yeah, I'm not sure I can really tell who's telling the truth, or I think this is going to be a really difficult experience, that doesn't exclude them, that they don't get out. Sometimes lawyers want to know, is there any of you who don't want to do this? A few years ago, we had a gentleman raise his hand. He didn't want to do it. He was chosen nevertheless, and he had a bit of a tantrum. But but it is, and there are certain topics, a sexual assault is always a difficult case for everybody involved. That's just a tough jury duty to have to deal with.
I kind of want to get into a little bit of the consequential nature of this. You said it's supposed to be hard. Like, these are people's lives, right? And there's a reason that juries exist. Is there anything more you can say about the consequential nature, like why jury duty is important?
We could hire professional jurors, and we don't, because we want just regular people living their lives to come in and use their common sense and experiences to process the information. It is a human endeavor. I mean, so it's clumsy. We have rules that kind of keep us kind of in guardrails for efficiency, for fairness. We don't want jurors to make decisions on irrational things like perhaps prior convictions of a defendant. Take a much easier example than something like a sexual assault, like a drunk driving, which actually is a fairly common case and a common trial. Jurors, the first question I get after they bring a verdict, when I go back and talk to them, is, does that defendant have any priors? And I'm like, well, we'll talk about that, but they want to know that because they wish they knew that, because that would help them make the decision. But that's actually not now using the facts of the case in front of them. It's using character evidence, which is not fair. I one time had to go to a jury who found a man not guilty of drunk driving, and he had an excellent lawyer. It was a really good trial. It was a fair trial. And they found him not guilty, and that's good. That's okay. And they asked that question. I said, well, you just found him not guilty of his 8th offense OWI. And they all go, oh, no, why didn't you tell us that? I'm like, because that's exactly what you would have done. You would have not listened. You just would have focused on that. So judges should not be making these decisions. The prosecutors have a role, an important role, and a lot of discretion, even including to dismiss a case. But their opinion about who's guilty or not guilty shouldn't be the controlling factor. It's a clumsy process, not always perfect, but it's really one of the best for resolving these kinds of questions. There's some challenges. Racial disparity in our courts is a huge local problem, and even nationally, but locally very much so. But we do have some positives. One is all of our trials, all of our proceedings are actually public. They're open to the public. And in a trial, it's not only open to the public, but the public is participating through the jury. They're not deciding, do we like this conduct? They're deciding, were evidence of a crime proved beyond a reasonable doubt. But they do get to shape that, and the public gets to do it. And so it's a public courtroom. And then the other strength of the jury process is that the jury has to be unanimous. And that's a really powerful tool. I mean, we all work with colleagues, and we don't always agree on how to do things. Maybe at CityCast, you have different opinions.
Oh, yeah. We're always on the exact same page.
And so getting 12 strangers to agree unanimously to such important matters, that they obviously just understand the importance, is really powerful.
This episode is brought to you by ShipStation. If you run an e-commerce business, you know how much work it takes to produce something great while dealing with complicated shipping issues. That's why over 130,000 companies have turned to ShipStation, an innovative tool that allows you to focus less on shipping and more on building your brand. With ShipStation, you can manage orders, label printing, reporting, and customer service on one easy-to-use dashboard. You'll reduce warehouse costs with reliable enterprise solutions and save thousands on shipping costs with discounts up to 89% off. Plus, you can effortlessly import orders from everywhere you sell online. So, turn your shipping challenges into opportunities for growth. Go to ShipStation.com and use code POD to sign up for your free 60-day trial. That's ShipStation.com, code POD.
Who serves on juries? It's supposed to be a jury of your peers, right?
Right, and that's been interpreted as a random sample of adults from your jurisdiction. So it's from Dane County. And we get a list, a master list from the Department of Transportation. We don't use voter polls. The master list is anybody who lives in the county. It's a random list. The master list is generally pretty close to demographically representative of the population. It's actually significantly underrepresenting people who identify Hispanic, which is interesting. But other race or ethnicities seem to kind of come very close to the master list. We have computer programs that randomly select about 300 jurors a week throughout the year to be summoned to the courthouse, and then some of those will come back undelivered. Some people won't respond to them. But about every week we bring in about 100 potential jurors. The list has to be random. Randomness and representativeness are not always
necessarily the same thing.
No. So from my review back in 2015 of actually getting representative jurors of particularly, like, say, Black citizens in Dane County, we were not getting as many as we would to be representative. But part of the complexity of this is that if the Black population is recognized at around 6%, 7%, that is actually about 1 out of 13 people, which is kind of common for a jury, that there would be one Black juror, maybe two. Sometimes you could have more. We had a trial last year there were 4 people who I know there's some risk in assuming how people identify, but I would have assumed they were probably African American. There was a person who was clearly had some family from parts of Asia. There was at least one Hispanic person. It was a very diverse jury. I have had a group of jurors, like 60 potential jurors, come into the courtroom and not a obvious non-white person among the entire group. And
wow.
Yeah. And that's
the randomness that you're talking about.
It's part of the randomness.
Yeah.
So at each step, there's a randomization that happens. The people who call back in or do show up is not necessarily random, but it's outside of our control. But then when people do show up, the lists are created randomly in terms of who actually would be assigned to go to the courtroom. And the order of that list is also random. So you could have people who would be representative of defendant by way of gender, age, race, all of the other kind of marks of peers, but they just randomly were not at the top of the list, and so they didn't make it up into the jury box for the jury selection.
Yeah, so it's definitely one of the conversations that I'm most fascinated about is about the representation of the jury pools. And that we could have a whole hour conversation on, actually. But as you said, it's not a perfect system. It's messy. I do want to ask you how often cases end up going to jury in the first place. Because you talked about the benefit. There are some really real benefits to having a jury. And we famously hear about how common plea deals are.
So we typically say, I just say 2% of the cases go to a jury trial, of the criminal cases. But that's actually only the felony cases. Misdemeanors, which are less serious matters that would be a maximum penalty, would be some jail, local jail. Often, though, could be just probation or a very short jail. The misdemeanor cases almost never go to trial. About 0.6%, less than 1% actually go to trial.
Wow. That's kind of crazy.
It is.
And
when I speak with lawyer groups, I've spoke at public defender conferences and at other places, law schools, and that I emphasize, I think there should be more misdemeanor trials. I actually think misdemeanor convictions are kind of a driver of what is identified as like mass incarceration of certain socioeconomic groups and racial groups. And that misdemeanors actually is a big driver of that, because a person who stands before a judge on a felony matter, perhaps maybe even, let's say, just a violent felony or whatever, but where prison is definitely on the table, if that person has like maybe a dozen misdemeanors, looks a lot different than a person who has 2 or none. And it's complicated about why do people get misdemeanors and how do they get arrested? How do they get charged, and then how do they get processed in the courts and so on, and then sentenced as well? But yeah, you're right. It's an hour at least another conversation.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you do favor having more jury trials, including for misdemeanors. I want to ask, what does it say about our criminal justice system that fewer cases are going to trial?
Well, it says a number of things in different jurisdictions. Why there are not more jury trials is a complicated issue. There's a lot of judges I'll say nationally, I'm not speaking of colleagues now, and certainly not myself, but who don't like trials. We have maybe 600 open cases, and when I'm doing a trial for a week, that's just one of the cases I have. And all of them are aging at different steps, but many judges complain about the work that goes into a trial. I love trials, and it's the kind of the pinnacle of the whole process and the lawyer profession, and I think of our democracy as well. And when it works well, then it's very satisfying, and it can be an amazing thing. So other reasons there's not more jury trials are, I would say, and not everyone likes to hear this answer. Actually, this is how I ended up meeting Aaron Hicks, a person you spoke with recently and a good friend of mine, that most people plead guilty because they are guilty, that the police are arresting the correct people. They want to arrest the correct people. The people are properly charged, sometimes overcharged, but then there's negotiations, and then there's something that is a plea, and they are guilty. Now, this doesn't ignore the reality that sometimes people admit to guilt for something they didn't do or that have been coerced into a plea. One thing that drives that in a lot of jurisdictions is people being held on high cash bail for low-level nonviolent crimes. And so they're told you can plead guilty to your disorderly conduct charge and get out of jail today for time served. Or if you want a trial, you're going to sit for 3 more months unless you can come up with $10,000. And where jurisdictions are doing that, that's coercing pleas. That's bad. We try not to do that. And for all of our criminal cases, over 80% actually do get a signature bond, which means they don't have to pay cash at all. They sign out.
So there's those outside pressures. I understand that statistically most trials end in conviction. Why is that, would you say? Is it for that same reason that?
No, not necessarily. It could be. I think every trial that goes, there's a reason for it. And sometimes jurors will say, wow, why did this even go to trial? And they do that in both directions, like where the guilt is really clear and obvious and just not just beyond a reasonable doubt, but just overwhelming any possible doubt. which is more than is necessary for a conviction, jurors will say, gosh, we don't understand. And other times, though, where they're clearly understand there just wasn't enough evidence at all, and why did this even go to trial, they'll say. But very often there is something to talk about, some issue and some factual dispute. And, there's a number of reasons why maybe they're more often a conviction. The state does have a huge amount of resources that are not necessarily balanced for a defendant. I mean, by way of police officers and lab technicians and crime labs and prosecutors. We deal with that by funding, as state employees, public defenders, and funding private lawyers to take public defender cases. And they're allowed to hire investigators and experts and so on. But it's still,
it's an unfair balance. Yeah, it's not a fair fight.
It's not equal that way. So there's two other reasons. One is that the plea offers are compromises from both sides. And in a civil case, where it's usually about money, you try to avoid the risk, the uncertainty of a jury, and you settle it. That's just money. For a criminal case, it's not money. It's freedom and life with convictions or not, and maybe free or not. But there's an agreement because the state will give up certain maximum penalty opportunities or certain charges and offer a defendant something that is just too good to pass. In some jurisdictions, there are people who believe that there's a trial penalty, that if a person refuses to settle, then the judge will give a harsher sentence sentencing. And if that perception is where that seems real, that's really bad. We try not to do that. Now, depending on the nature of the case, like if a defendant pleads guilty to something like a sexual assault or harm against a child and spares that alleged victim the experience of coming to the courtroom and testifying, it's the defendant who's asking the judge, give me credit for that. Give me a break. And any reasonable judge would and say, yeah, that's a very positive thing you did for that person. And so you get credit for that. So a defendant who says I'm guilty will get a credit, particularly where there's a victim, that a defendant who goes to trial just can't even ask for because they didn't do that. Now, they have the right to the trial. The judge shouldn't say, if you had pled guilty to the same charge, I would have done this or that. We don't do that, but or you shouldn't do that. But anyway.
Yeah, this whole conversation is so fascinating and illuminating for one of our important duties, as citizens, right, as mutual community members. It's so lovely to meet you and hear, how some of this works. Before we let you go, we wanted to ask, this is more kind of a lighthearted question, but do you have any good excuses you've heard over the years of folks trying to get out of jury duty?
Well, no good excuse, but some obvious excuses. We did 20 jury trials last year, and I think it was early last year, a defendant, not that it's relevant, but the defendant happened to be a white young man, but a white juror was asked, have any of you ever made up your mind about the guilt or innocence of the defendant? We just want to kind of process the idea of presumption of innocence. And I have some questions to do that. And this young male juror raised his hand and said, yeah, I have. And he turned to the defendant across the room and just said, sorry, dude, you just look guilty to me. And I was so angry. And the guy clearly wanted to get out of jury service.
That's absurd.
And it really ticked the other jurors off. And so I kind of, I kicked that guy out. And then I had a nice little conversation with the other jurors about how improper that is to say or do. And clearly the guy just was trying to get out, and I had to kick him out.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate it, Judge McNamara, and for you giving us the time to talk about this important thing. It's an honor, and you are the Honorable Judge McNamara. So thank you so much.
So be sure to call me again when you get called to jury service or whatever. And if I see you in the courthouse, I'll be sure not to ask why you're here.
Fabulous.
Thank you very much.
That was Dane County Circuit Court Judge Nicholas McNamara. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm Dylan Brogan. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone who swears to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Until then,